Good morning and welcome to the second meeting of the third meeting, I beg your pardon, of the Burrell Collection, Lending and Borrowing Scotland Bill Committee. Can I remind all present to turn off their mobile phones and BlackBerry type devices, as these can interfere with the sound system. We have an apology today from Gordon MacDonald MSP, who's been unable to attend, although he has submitted some written questions through his colleagues, and we have no additional MSPs as far as I can see. So I'd like to welcome our witnesses, Sir Peter Hutchison, Chair of the Burrell Trustees, and Mr Robert Taylor, the Law Agent of the Testamentary Trustees of the Burrell Collection. Our first decision for the committee today is to take item 3 on the committee's consideration of evidence taken and next steps in its scrutiny of the bill at the preliminary stage in private. Are we agreed?
Agreed.
Yes. Okay. Can I just, before I begin, inform everyone that time is very tight for the meeting, and can I request that questions and answers remain succinct? I welcome the panel again and would invite some short opening statements from you.
If I may. Convener, thank you for the opportunity to present this information to your committee. And you will be familiar, I'm sure, of much of the territory that underlies this proposed bill from your earlier hearings. So with your permission, I would like to make a short statement on some of the key issues, very much from the trustees' viewpoint. But I should perhaps start by saying that trustees give the strongest possible welcome to the refurbishment of the Burrell building. We have been agitating about the roof, quite frankly, for some years now, and it's not just a matter of drips and buckets. It will refresh the design, it will make a better use of space, it will enable more of the collection to be displayed and more of it to revolve on display. And in spite of the problems of overseas lending, we recognise that the tour, I think, has tremendous potential. I believe that this is the first major display of the Burrell Collection and outside the Burrell building since the Hayward Gallery exhibition in 1975. I believe that exhibition, the Hayward Gallery exhibition, produced acclaim and astonishment at the richness and spread of the collection. And it was quite instrumental at that time in government finance being made available to build the present Burrell building. And we hope that the tour will produce a similar appreciation and will also encourage scholarship funding. The two core issues I wanted to raise are the setting aside of the donor's wishes and the ability with safety to exhibit articles from the Burrell collection overseas. The connecting thread between these two, of course, is the assumption that Sir William Burrell considered that lending overseas was essentially riskier than lending within the UK, and his experience of the shipping world led him to distrust the travel element. The first assumption, I'm sure, must be true. The second may be, but I think is more complicated situation. You will be aware that the trustees are now assuming, or hopefully will be assuming, a new role, monitoring lending in general, but with a long stop position, rather than wicket keeper, I think, long stop position on overseas loan. We will obviously be working in very close consultation with Glasgow Life, as we have been doing. And this is new territory for us, but of course it's not for them. And they have a lending policy for Glasgow Life already in place, and it applies to their museums as a whole. However, specific to us and attached to this bill is a new lending code for the Burrell, which we believe will give a rigorous and effective process for evaluating loans, both overseas and in the UK. All loans that have survived the earlier filtering processes will be seen by us, and naturally some will be more straightforward than others, but we should be watchful, and we will not hesitate to get external advice if needed. Having spent some 25 years in the insurance industry in Glasgow, I am not conditioned to underestimate risk, or indeed to make easy assumptions about it. The trustees have, I believe, a duty to Sir William in making sure these risks are assessed and mitigated as far as possible. I'll briefly comment on the issue of donors' wishes. In the case of closed institutions like the Wallace Collection or the Frick, which neither lend nor borrow, in a way on this subject life is made fairly simple. But the Burrell Collection has never been like that. Sir William lent extensively during his lifetime, and since it found a home in Pollock Park, lending from the collection within the United Kingdom has continued, on the whole uneventfully. Then, after the 1997 parliamentary inquiry, the ground shifted. The panel of commissioners drawn from the House of Lords gave a recommendation that the non-fragile items, which of course form the bulk of the collection, should be allowed to travel abroad, although the fragile media such as pastels and tapestries and the like should not be allowed to move outside, or not be allowed to exhibit it outside the Burrell building. Well, although never enacted, in effect the Parliament of the day has spoken. This finding of the commissioners has partly freed the trustees and enabled them to consider limited overseas lending subject to rigorous safeguards. We believe the lending code provides these necessary safeguards to protect the integrity of the collection. It's always speculative to try and imagine what the reactions of a donor to a new situation might have been had he been alive. Nevertheless, I think trustees sometimes have to have a go at it, to try it. I presume that the Barnes trustees did the same exercise. I like to think that some 55 years after Sir William's death, if I was to hold this imaginary conversation between my conscience and his, he would react favorably if I asked him to trust his trustees. And this convener is where the ability to make the final decision on overseas lending matters is critical. I would expect it to be seldom, perhaps never used. But in a sense, we still hold Sir William's pen in our hands. In 1997, those commissioners I was talking about enjoined us and Glasgow to engage in constructive discussion. This has been our recent experience with Glasgow Life, and we intend that it should continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Peter. Mr. Taylor, do you have an opening statement you wish to make?
If I may, Madam Convener, yes. I have acted as the legal advisor for the Trust since 1984, and my firm before that acted for the Trust for as long as it has been in existence since Sir William Burrell died. In fact, we also acted for Sir William Burrell, and my firm prepared his will. Now, do cut me short if I digress and cover ground that other speakers will be covering, but if I can comment briefly on some of the legal issues as they relate to the Burrell Collection, which affect both the trustees and the council, and also why, having been persuaded by Glasgow Life that wider lending powers for the collection could be of benefit, the trustees have decided to support the bill which is before you at present. Now, in terms of the memorandum signed between Sir William and Lady Burrell and the corporation in 1944, Sir William, as you know, donated his art collection to the city but subject to various stipulations. These included an undertaking to keep the collection intact in the building which was eventually to be built. There was an express provision allowing the city to make temporary loans of items from the collection to responsible institutions within Great Britain. Sir William further undertook in the agreement that his will would provide a fund to be administered by trustees to allow additions to be made to the Burrell Collection. And he further stipulated that plans of the future Burrell Gallery were to be approved either by him or by his testamentary trustees if the building had not been built by the time he died. The deed, however, did not provide any clear legal role for his testamentary trustees in relation to the Burrell Collection. Now, in terms of Sir William Burrell's will of 1953, the residue of his estate was left in trust, with trustees being directed to apply the income for the purchase of additions for the Burrell Collection. Many of the terms in the 1944 agreement were repeated in the will, and this ensures that any items purchased by the trustees for the Burrell Collection, which you will remember had already been donated, were covered by the same restrictions regarding lending and etc. In the will, however, he imposed an additional restriction on future lending, which prevented articles such as tapestries, pastels, carpets, rugs, lace, and needlework being loaned at all. Now, this restriction is fully effective to cover items purchased by the trustees for the Burrell Collection, but there is considerable legal doubt whether Sir William unilaterally in his will could amend restrictions that he had previously imposed in an agreement in 1944. There are therefore two deeds which govern the lending from the Burrell Collection, and the deeds are not entirely symmetrical in their terms. Now, as you're aware, in 1992, the City Council promoted private legislation in the UK Parliament to amend the terms both of the will and of the 1944 agreement. And this was to allow the Burrell Collection to be loaned out with Great Britain. Unfortunately, there had not been overmuch consultation with the trustees at the time, and the trustees opposed the draft provisional order on the basis that Sir William Burrell's clearly stated intentions regarding lending should be upheld. The inquiry took place in October and November 1997 and lasted for about 5 weeks. There was a vast quantity of evidence led before the inquiry regarding donors' wishes, modern transportation techniques, the benefits of reciprocal lending between institutions to promote research, and also the perceived financial benefits to Glasgow museums through being able to lend the Burrell Collection freely. The committee heard, and in fact you will have heard much of this evidence before you, and in fact probably after we have departed. The parliamentary commissioners confirmed that the trustees did have an interest in the Burrell Collection, and indeed a right and a duty to enforce the conditions which applied to the collection. They did, however, find in favour of widening lending beyond Great Britain, subject to the proviso that certain categories of items which they considered to be fragile, and these are the items which were mentioned in Sir William's will, should not be loaned at all. In other words, they had to stay within the Burrell Collection, which previously had not been thought to be the case. Now, that outcome was not quite what I think either party envisaged at the time, and although persuasive, the Commissioner's findings are not law because the City did not proceed further with the provisional order. The Commissioners did not address the issue of how future lending to and from the Burrell was to take place, and indeed they did not specify what role the trustees would have in relation to the future administration and lending from the Burrell. They did, however, urge both parties to cooperate for the benefit of the future, for the benefit of the collection in future. Now, as Sir Peter has stated in his submission, one consequence of the Commissioner's findings was to release the trustees from the absolute requirement to uphold Sir William Burrell's lending restrictions strictly. And since 1997, the City and the trustees have worked towards a satisfactory and workable arrangement to regulate all lending to and from the Burrell Collection. The trustees' central role in relation to lending is firmly established under the Lending Code. Their agreement must be obtained for all lending, both to and from the Burrell Collection. And on the strength of this, the trustees feel able to support the lending bill, which is presently before your committee for consideration. Now, I would suggest that the Lending Code, by providing a mechanism for amendment in future, which is not the case with the 1944 agreement or with Sir William Burrell's will, enables the parties, if they mutually agree, to make changes to lending procedures if subsequent experience shows this to be necessary and desirable. Now, as you will have heard previously from Mr. Eccles, legislation by the Scottish Parliament is the only effective way of allowing the conditions imposed both by the will and by the agreement to be amended. Now, I hope this resume has been of some interest and benefit to the committee, and I thank you for allowing me to speak.
Thank you very much, Mr. Taylor. Can I begin by addressing Sir Peter in terms of the fact that the trustees were opposed, as you say yourself, to changing the will in 1997. You suggested in your statement that the trustees had changed their mind because the decision had been made by the Parliament of the day. Was there evidence that was led that persuaded you to change your mind?
My understanding is not that the law changed as a result of the 1997 finding by the four House of Lords representatives, but they came out with a recommendation which would have been the basis of a law if that had been enacted. And therefore, we took that as evidence, as it were, that this was the mind of Parliament rather than the will of Parliament at that time. And that is why we started to look again at loosening the lending overseas situation. I think going back to the other bit of your question, I think the wish to preserve Sir William's will exactly as it was, we always felt that there were going to be problems here, but it had rolled along thereafter in an unsatisfactorily unclear way. As Robert has said, there are two different documents saying slightly different things. And that is really one of the reasons why I hope we are here now to try and get a settled situation where everybody knows what's happening.
But in terms of the trustees changing their mind about lending, is that because you're persuaded by evidence about improved methods of transportation, for example?
Yes, that is one of the factors. There are really quite a number of factors. I think it's quite clear that transportation is safer, I think, on the whole. I wouldn't put too much emphasis on that because I think actually quite a lot of the accidents take place. You know, when something's been taken off the wall, packed away, and then in some other destination, lifted out, put up on another wall. I mean, accidents can take place of that kind. I think the change that has now taken place is that we're looking at it on a world basis. And so what we shall be looking at is not just the safety of, shall we say, an aeroplane or versus a ship, but also the destination that it will be going to, the political situation in that country, the chances of, I don't know, extreme weather events or something like that. There are much wider issues that come into play once you start traveling overseas, and they're not just about the travel.
I see. In terms of the discrepancy between the agreement and the will, which Mr Taylor's outlined, I know that my colleague Mark Griffin wants to ask you some more detailed questions about that later, but I would like to ask, you've already outlined that the commissioners in 1997 didn't give a complete carte blanche for lending, that delicate items were of concern to them and they didn't think they should be lent. When we were looking around, we had the great pleasure of looking around the borough and speaking to some of the conservators last week, and certainly the view was that the pastorals, the Rega pastorals, should really never be lent because pastorals can't be transported. But these changes, you would give carte blanche for these delicate pastorals to be lent abroad, and that seems to me to be a very considerable departure from previous thinking.
I absolutely take your point, Convener, and agree with it. Technically, the pastorals could be lent abroad, but perhaps it might help if I gave an example of how in that particular case the system is already beginning to work in perhaps not a well, there is no legal enactment yet, but in a discursive way, and through agreement. A little while ago, I spoke to one of the senior, Dr. Ella McAdam, in fact, and said to her, you know, if this thing happens, I think the trustees would take an awful lot of persuading ever to lend a pastoral abroad. She didn't reply at that time, but I noticed that I've only just seen the list this morning, incidentally. There are no pastorals. The list of proposed loans, what actual items are going. There are no pastorals among it. Now, I'm not suggesting that if we hadn't mentioned it, they might have gone. But I think that is the common sense, article by article approach that hopefully will be a benefit in future. In other words, it's much more pragmatic. Instead of taking categories, I think pastorals are a fairly discrete category as far as it, but if you take textiles, that covers a huge variety of robustness. We may hear more of this later. And I think taking things, each case on its own merits, has a lot to be said for it.
Of course, it's pointed out to us that the kind of heart and soul of the Burrell Collection, although it has many jewels, are the tapestries, medieval tapestries. So therefore, a blockbuster touring exhibition of the world without the tapestries wouldn't have the same commercial potential. Is that perhaps why this aspect of the will is being changed?
Yes, the tapestries, as you say, they're one of the biggest jewels in the crown, if you might, whatever you like. In that case, there is a huge variety in terms of robustness. Quite a lot of very fine bits of tapestry have been taken from larger original tapestries and perhaps mounted a metre by a metre. And very often those are actually mounted on some sort of firm basis. And they're obviously much easier and less risky to transport than a full-blown, some of these magnificent great tapestries, which have to be rolled, unrolled, hoisted, and of course the strain on all the fabric is considerable. And those are the sort of considerations. I'm speaking as if I knew all the story, but we obviously rely on conservators to explain this to us. So there is a wide variety between bits of tapestry which are carefully mounted already and some of these very large, several meters by several meters, covering a whole wall.
And just my last question concerns the need to refurbish the gallery, which in your opening statement you made clear was very important to you, and certainly during our tour we were made very aware of the difficulties that the gallery was experiencing in terms of water ingress. When we took evidence last week from Dr McConnell and Councillor Graham, they were they were clear that the sponsorship for a touring exhibition would help fund the refurbishment of the gallery, but it's quite a significant sum that they have come up with, 45 million for refurbishment. Given that the changes that are being proposed in the bill mean that lending would take place indefinitely, how would you feel if the funding did not raise enough money to refurbish the gallery? So you agree to the lending, but you don't get the gallery refurbished. How important is the refurbishment of the gallery in the calculation to change the will?
Well, to answer the last bit first, I mean, the refurbishment of the gallery is absolutely the closest thing to our hearts, I think. We enormously welcome that. As to the money, I suppose there is no guarantee. It's not particularly our function to do any major fundraising, but I think it's very difficult to assess. I think the Barnes collection, which was circulated in a rather similar way before its refurbishment, I think that the amount raised was 7 million in a similar, I think that was the figure. At any rate, I mean, there are sums, but whether 15 million can be raised, I do not know.
Because it seems like, you know, without the 15 million, the sums don't add up.
You're quite right. If the whole thing comes a little hesitant on these figures, because 45 million sounds a sort of nice, tidy, round sum. And, you know, these things tend to vary over the years. It's a 4-year exercise. I think one has to go and look for other sources if that's the case. I know the Heritage Lottery Fund, they are going to tap. Glasgow itself is going to put up some of the money. And of course, they had a rather similar situation when they were making a substitute for the transport, the riverside, in other words. I think there was a shortfall, am I not right, in the amount that was actually raised as they expected.
I have a quick supplementary from my colleague Jackson Carlow.
Yes, thank you, Speaker. You've raised the Barnes collection a couple of times, and obviously you will come to similar decisions as the Barnes trustees did. But in lending their collection abroad, in Washington, the Matisse painting mural was badly damaged, and the Picasso suffered damage and restoration in Tokyo. Now, both Washington and Tokyo, I imagine, gave guarantees in relation to the way in which these items would be treated, which ultimately proved not necessarily to have been upheld in the event. And I wonder what balance you place then, as somebody in the insurance industry, on the guarantees that are offered in respect to such important loans, given that these were not what I would call kind of unreliable countries in principle, but in practice, really priceless items were damaged in consequence.
You're quite right that has been damaged. Nobody would try and deny that. Though sometimes people, shall we say, make it sound rather less than it was. There is no guarantee that there will be no damage. There is no such thing as risk-free, even in the existing gallery. It's just how much it increases by going abroad or going to a particular destination. One of the tasks, I think, for the trustee is to look very carefully at how these incidents have arisen. I've written to Dr. Penny, who raised some concerns of this kind, to ask him for as much detail, in confidence, of course, as he can give, because the trustees are anxious to learn how these arose and in what circumstances. Because risk can be, it can't be eliminated, but it can be mitigated. And for example, one of the subjects we've been discussing is that if a fairly large number of items are traveling in a foreign country or to a foreign country, that they should never all travel in one aeroplane, that it should be split up between a number, because nobody can guarantee that an aeroplane won't crash and the result for any collection could be extremely severe. But otherwise, as I say, there is nothing risk-free. You can only perhaps keep it in your own building and never let anything move.
I'd like to go on to my colleague Mark Griffin.
Thank you, Commuter. Sir Peter, why do you think that Sir William stipulated in the will and in the agreement that the building where the collection was housed should only contain the collection and items that were subsequently added?
Yes, that's right. Well, it has been a practice for really quite a long time to include temporary loans of related subjects to a Burrell exhibition. In other words, if I may sort of take an example, if his collection of Crawhall watercolours, which is marvellous and well known, I think it has been allowed that one or two from outside can be added in, provided it's made perfectly clear these are not Burrell items, but just to give comparison. I think it would diminish some exhibitions. In fact, in some cases, make them really hardly worth having if you couldn't pull in some external comparative material from outside. I think it is one of the almost essential parts of museum practice.
So the trustees in Glasgow Life are already operating against the will and agreement of Sir William by displaying items from outside the collection?
I don't think it was an absolute, in my view. Have you got the figures there, the actual...
Lady Convener, could I just assist here? I think one of the distinctions to draw is exhibiting on a permanent basis at the Burrell Collection items which were not either donated by Sir William or Lady Burrell or acquired by the trustees, and bringing in temporary exhibits which are clearly marked as such and which do not form part of the permanent collection. They would be, for instance, in a separate exhibition room. They would be separately labelled, so that when visitors came to the Burrell, they would be under no illusion as to what was the Burrell collection and what actually were external exhibits which had been brought in for the purpose of making the Burrell for a more attractive venue to attend, because there was a major exhibition of Degas or French Impressionists or whatever, items which in fact complement what the Burrell already has. So there's no question here of the trustees sanctioning a departure from Sir William's wishes.
Again, you would expect that provision to continue with the new borrowing power, that no item would be permanently displayed with
Absolutely, it's in the lending code. I can assure you of that.
I think if I may make a further comment on that, the integrity of the collection, which I think was really what Sir William was getting at, is of great importance to us. And we would never wish to sanction an exhibition which, as it were, swamped the Burrell items or failed to make it clear that this was a strong part of the Burrell's collection and these were added in for comparative or interest purposes. I think it needs to be quite distinct.
Thank you for that. We've spoken already about the difference between the will and the agreement, where the will specified certain items which Sir William didn't want to see lent outside of the collection. What do you think are the reasons for the differences between the will and the agreement in relation to the pastels, tapestries, carpets, rugs, lace and needlework and other textiles?
I'm not sure, honestly, why he came to a different conclusion between when the two documents were drawn up. I think there was quite a time difference between them. When he came to make his will, and a certain firm we know did actually draw it up, I would guess that he was trying to firm up the safety and the integrity issues, because by then he was in his 90s, I think. And so he drew up this fairly not very well-defined category, which ends up by talking about fabrics generally, or you know, tapestries, carpets, rugs, and of course that would cover things like tsunamis, which are quite modern and which we have an interesting collection of, which are kind of sort of decorative bedspreads that are quite recent. And he bought one or two, and one has been bought recently. So there is a sort of lack of definition with, at one end, extremely fragile stuff, and at the other end, really quite robust fabrics that are unlikely to be damaged.
Do you think that with the new conditions that were imposed with the will, that Glasgow Life in lending some of the delicate items which weren't specified in the agreement but were specified in the will, that Glasgow Life are perhaps operating within the letter of the law but not perhaps the spirit of Sir William's intentions when he perhaps had a change of heart and drew up his will?
Well, I do realise that there's a legal point here that, you know, some articles would fall under that, but the others that were more recently acquired by the trustees are technically, I think there was a good deal of argument in 1997 about that particular point. But I think that's one of the sort of areas of uncertainty which this bill would clarify now. There will be a similar regime right across the board, and we will be looking at things much more on a case-by-case basis rather than categories which should not be lent, which in some cases are rather ill-defined.
Madam Convener, could I make a point in a part answer to Mr. Griffin's remarks about the discrepancy between the will and the agreement? The committee are obviously aware that the agreement of 1944 was amended by Sir William Burrell during his lifetime with the agreement of the city, and this was to do with the siting of the future building. In fact, it was amended on many occasions. But one rather interesting thing that Sir William Burrell did not do when he raised these issues of the siting of the Burrell Collection was to introduce into the agreement the restrictions which he put in his will. Now, whether this was, one cannot guess the reasons why this issue was not raised by Sir William while he lived, but perhaps he may be, who can say why these points or why these restrictions were put in the will? But certainly what we do know is he did not attempt during his lifetime to vary the 44 agreement and impose the restrictions on the fragile items over the whole collection. And the legal issue, which I think we've tried to make clear, is that if these restrictions were not in the 1944 agreement, they could not govern the collection that Sir William had already donated to the city. So you have the bulk of the Burrell collection, including pastels and tapestries, which can at present be loaned within Great Britain, admittedly, but they can be loaned from the Burrell. And that is the practice which hitherto has been adopted by the city. So you then have the restrictions in the will which attach to a much narrower group of items. These are only items, the fragile items, which the trustees have purchased. So you have a very difficult situation to manage a gallery with conditions attaching to the bulk of the collection, but slightly different conditions attaching to the rest of the collection, those items which the trustees have purchased. And one of the aims of the lending code and the lending bill is to harmonise the whole collection and treat it as a single entity.
Thank you very much. Given the constraints on time, I'll have to move on to questions from Jackson Carlo.
Sorry, Mr. Taylor. Other cities, other cities were interested in the bequest, and I wonder if they had known or had anticipated that they could now freely set aside the terms of the agreement, whether Glasgow would have the collection at all.
Well, I think that is a question really one cannot answer because one has no idea. The conditions certainly are being modified, but I hope you will concede that they're being modified in such a way as will facilitate the administration of the collection, which at present can be loaned within Great Britain. The risk attaching to a loan in Great Britain to a loan to, say, the Louvre is probably no greater. Now, that is maybe my own personal view, and perhaps I shouldn't put that forward, but there is perhaps legally very little to distinguish lending within Great Britain to lending elsewhere. If the principle of lending is possible, which Sir William Burrell made possible, then...
And the presumption, though, is that he didn't understand that.
Oh, I don't think there can be any presumption at all. He may, for whatever reason...
In a sense, you are presuming, in the definition that you've just given, that there is no distinction, frankly, legally or in any other sense, between a loan in the UK or a loan abroad. Surely Sir William appreciated that point and yet made the stipulation that he did.
No, I do accept that. But had he made lending altogether prohibited, there would have been a greater logicality than by allowing lending within Great Britain, which, after all, excludes Northern Ireland from lending to France or Germany or whatever.
I'll ask a couple of technical questions, just briefly. I mean, this draft lending code, which is being established, it does give a clear role to the trustees in approving decisions to lend from or borrow into the Burrell Collection. However, the trustees will only have the final say in relation to items to be loaned abroad. Where the trustees refuse permission for loans to institutions in Great Britain, or for items to be borrowed into the collection, the matter is now to be referred to an expert to make the final decision. Do you think those arrangements are appropriate? And given that the power to borrow into the collection is new and contrary to the wishes of Sir William, would it be appropriate for the trustee? Would it not be appropriate for the trustees to have the final say in relation to all these decisions, rather than them to being deferred to an expert? We have an allergy to experts in Parliament.
Shall I answer that? Yes, there is a difference there that did not pass unnoticed when we were discussing all this. The reason for Glasgow Life retaining, as it were, the final say, or rather allocating it to an expert, is that they already performed that function, and the ordinary lending or lending of non-fragile items had been going on for quite a long time. The new category was the overseas lending, and that was where it had been so specifically refused by Sir William that we felt that the trustees should maintain a final long-stop ability to say no. But after all, the city were already in a position where lending within the UK, they were sanctioning regularly.
In terms of items being borrowed into the collection, I understand, you know, that from Glasgow Life that on occasion these might be items Sir William himself had bid for and not obtained and had hoped one day would be displayed with the collection. I saw a logic to that. Yeah. But you will not have any power of discretion as trustees over what can be borrowed into the collection, and it's perfectly conceivable, surely, that you might think that some items being borrowed in are not appropriate, but will have no say as trustees in regard to that.
Well, I don't think we have no powers at all. I mean, we can recommend very strongly against, and I think that if we felt an article they were proposing to borrow was not appropriate, I think we would make our views quite clear. Now, it may not be in the same situation as the overseas lending, where we do have a final veto, if you like the word. But I think this is going to, we hope, be a fairly cooperative understanding between us, or way of working between us and Glasgow Life, unlike before 1997.
You draw a distinction, say, between, say, me making my views perfectly clear in this Parliament, where they're comprehensively ignored, and you as a trustee making your views expressly known, having an influence over the final result, even if the power was not there.
Yes, I mean, we will be making representations to them, and have already been doing so on certain occasions. That really, I think, is fine.
In order, under the lending code, you're going to have to obtain advice, and this new does give a power to obtain advice. I mean, I take it that the funding of this would come from within the income existing within the trust. You don't anticipate that in any way being a burden?
No, I think we would be. I think it's been understood by the trustees that if they want external advice, they would have to probably pay for it.
Finally,
unless, sorry,
I'm happy to accept that. And finally, in the evidence we heard last week, the whole business of generating revenue in order to fund the future display and refurbishment. What would Sir William have made of that, do you think? Would he have been content to think that a bequest that he was giving for aesthetic reasons, if you like, to be displayed and into the care of the city, which he hoped would undertake that function, that if you like, the pecuniary interest and exploitation of the collection as a fundraising source, would he have welcomed that?
Sir William was a fairly shrewd money man. I think he was not averse, probably, to deriving the odd penny from a variety of sources, and certainly he always drove extremely hard bargains. I think it's speculation, but I think he would not have been too upset at the idea.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much to our witnesses. I'll now suspend briefly for the second panel of witnesses. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Can I welcome our second panel of witnesses to the committee? We have Mr Peter Wilkinson, General Manager in Scotland of Constantine's, Miss Frances Leonard, Senior Textile Lecturer in Conservation at the Centre for Textile Conservation and Technical Art History, and Mr Michael Daly, Director of Artwatch UK. I understand that Mr Daly would like to make an opening statement. Mr Wilkinson, would you also wish to make an opening statement?
At this time?
No. Okay. Well, if I could invite a brief opening statement from Mr Daly, and then we'll proceed with questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. Like the director of the National Gallery in London and the members of Donor Watch and Barnes Watch who submitted evidence to this committee, we are greatly disturbed by the present attempt to overturn Burrell's prohibition on foreign loans. It is said to have been made necessary by structural problems in the collection's building, but it is also said to be necessary to help fund the repairs to the museum. There is clearly a very serious problem with the roof, but it is not clear why it should cost £45 million and require that the entire collection be closed to the public for 4 years. To help justify this draconian solution, we are being assured that today's means of international travel are perfectly safe, or acceptably safe, and that today's art handlers never make mistakes. Neither is the case. Just last month, a Canova sculpture was dropped and smashed beyond repair when being moved a short distance professionally in Italy. A few years ago, Canova's Scottish-owned marble, the Three Graces, was cracked when loaned to Spain. Recently, when 3 gilded bronze panels from Ghiberti's doors in Florence were sent on a travelling show to the United States, they were sent in 3 separate planes to reduce the known risks. In 2007, a spokesman for the art handlers, Constantine, said that museums are under pressure to loan works to as many as 5, 10, or even 15 venues when on tour. Many curators, such as Nicholas Penny, and conservators, such as those in Poland who recently appealed to Artwatch for assistance, are resisting such pressures which can be awesome. The present director of the Metropolitan Museum in New York, Thomas Campbell, boasted recently that, quote, "No one but the Met could have pulled off the exhibition of Renaissance tapestries a few years ago. We bribed and cajoled and twisted the arms of institutions around the world. Well, we didn't bribe, of course, but politically it was very complicated. Just this Tuesday, Art Daily reported that 48 incomparable and irreplaceable medieval treasures from the UNESCO-listed cathedral in Hildesheim have gone on show at the Met. Imagine the catastrophe if one of the planes had gone down over the Atlantic, as did a Swiss Air jet a few years ago when carrying diamonds and paintings, including a Picasso. The Burrell Collection is not presently at such risk, and it will remain so if, as we most strongly urge, this Parliament rejects the request to overturn Burrell's still perfectly well-founded prohibition on foreign travels for works in his collection. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Daly. If I could come back on a couple of the points that you made. In her evidence last week, Dr McConnell from Glasgow Live was asked about the criticisms reported in the Herald that were made by Dr Penny, which you mentioned yourself. And her response was to say that she was surprised to hear the view of Dr Penny, not least because we loan items from our museum collection to him. Indeed, he has asked for a Rembrandt from the Kelvin Grove Museum, probably our most valuable item for a major exhibition in London next year. And Sir Angus Grossart also made the point that Dr Penny's comments were inconsistent with his own practice. Would you care to comment on that?
Yes, that's perfectly true, Convener. Dr Penny is in a very awkward position, clearly, as director of the National Gallery. The National Gallery has loans policies, but he has, from the beginning, made it clear that he disapproves in general terms of loans. He thinks far too many loans are made at far too much risk, and he has sought to introduce new types of exhibitions at the National Gallery in which the need to draw in works from abroad is greatly reduced. He thinks that many blockbuster exhibitions, in fact, are quite naked revenue raisers that serve little or no academic or scholarly purpose, and he is personally very keen and very committed to develop exhibitions that are more thoughtful, more helpful to the public, and that introduce less famous, less well-knowns insofar as borrowings are made.
Thank you. Of course, there is another way to look at the principle of loans, in that it allows more people to see these precious artworks. And as Dr McConnell said last week, in her evidence it's for the benefit of humanity that the maximum number of people can see works. And not only would, say, for example, the people of New York be able to see items from the Burrell if it was lent there, but reciprocal agreements would mean people from Glasgow who can't afford to go to New York might at some point in the future see precious items lent to Glasgow from New York. Would you care to comment on that argument?
Well, yes, that is perfectly true, but there is a problem with it in that not everybody in the world can see all the works of art in the world, or even many of them at the same time. And when these great exhibitions are put together, as has happened increasingly in recent years, that have drawn many works from important artists like Leonardo at the National Gallery and Raphael at the National Gallery and Vermeer in The Hague and the Washington National Gallery and London and the Metropolitan Museum, the accompanying propaganda and promotion and brouhaha creates impossible conditions for people to view the works. I mean, unless you're a privileged member of the press and are shown in early in the morning over breakfast and can see the paintings in peace and tranquility, it's hardly worth going to these exhibitions. I mean, to be standing behind 9 people looking at a small Vermeer isn't really any kind of a privilege.
Mr Wilkinson, your company was mentioned in Mr Daly's opening statement. Perhaps you would like to comment on some of the examples that he gave of damage to artworks and the risks associated with transportation.
I think, as Michael has correctly said, there's always going to be a risk with transportation. Much of the damage that is being described is more of a handling scenario. It could be for a variety of reasons, but it is not specifically related to the direct transportation of that object. It's the handling of it either at point of origin or at point of destination.
But clearly things go wrong. I mean, some of the examples Mr Daly
Human
gave
business,
were
things can go wrong,
yeah,
yes.
Right. Can I ask a specific question that's come up in the course of our evidence gathering, and that is the collection of pastels within the Burrell, particularly the Degas pastels. The Conservatives have suggested to us that it's always dangerous to move pastels because the pastel basically doesn't stick to the paper and no way can be found to make that happen. What's your view on transporting pastels?
It is very difficult. It's a very complex packing process that you would go through for a pastel. But again, it is quite correct that it is one of the most difficult objects to move.
And I've got some questions for Ms Leonard in terms of textile. I know you're expert in textile conservation. We were taken by the Conservators and spoke to the textile conservator at the Burrell last week, and she talked at some length about some of the challenges with regard to textiles, particularly because global warming has increased the life cycle of the moth, and moth infestation is now a real problem that they have to contend with. Do you think that that challenge has a bearing on the lending of tapestries?
I don't think that does have a bearing on the lending of tapestries. I think that tapestries and other textiles are vulnerable, but the particular risks that they face are indeed things like moth, things like high light levels, things like high relative humidity levels or fluctuating humidity levels, and poor handling. You know, I think those are probably key risks to textiles, and you know, those can occur wherever they happen to be. Really, I don't think there is an intrinsic risk in moving a tapestry, for example.
Right. Do you think that the transportation of textiles has improved since Burrell wrote his will?
Yes, undoubtedly, yes. I think that the packing and the care of all classes of museum objects has hugely changed since the time when Burrell wrote his will. I mean, there is a whole new class of professional museum conservator who care for objects in terms of preventive conservation, making sure that the environmental conditions that they're subject to are appropriate and are controlled, and also who intervene on objects to carry out treatments. And that is very different from when Burrell wrote his will.
In terms of galleries out with the UK, we obviously have an accreditation scheme within the UK that's administered, I understand, by the Arts Council of England, but there doesn't seem to be a systematic way to assess galleries overseas in terms of whether they meet the standards of that Arts Council accreditation scheme. Do you have concerns about some galleries around the world and how they handle textiles?
Yes, I think you wouldn't want to lend to just any gallery around the world. I think you would certainly want to be sure that the gallery conducted itself in a professional manner, and the Arts Council accreditation scheme, it certainly lays down a baseline of professional standards which a museum should meet, and I would certainly want to be assured that any receiving museum or gallery met those standards.
I wonder if other panel members would care to comment on that discrepancy, the fact that the accreditation scheme doesn't apply to museums abroad, and how can lenders satisfy themselves that a museum that they're lending to meets those standards?
In reality, it may well depend on the lending agreement. It may be that the borrowing gallery or institution is visited by Glasgow Life, if you like, that would obviously have the Arts Council criteria and see how it compares, how it can be improved, and if it can't be improved, then take a view on lending in the first place.
Mr. Daly?
Could I say that, Convener, that in his submission to the committee, Nick Tinari of Barnes Watch pointed out that when permission was given to loan works from the Barnes collection on an exceptional basis against the wishes of the bequester, the courts were assured that the entire enterprise would be conducted to the very highest levels of expertise and professionalism, and that the conservators at the National Gallery in Washington would prepare the reports, the condition reports, and supervise and so forth. And yet when he followed the works around the world, he produced a catalogue of injuries and errors, and many of them were made on the advice of conservators and relied on their expertise and their judgment. We really should take, I'm sorry to say, with a very great pinch of salt, assurances and aspirations and wishes and codes and best practices and organisations and vetting procedures, even if they're clearly laid out, which I don't get the impression in the case of the Burrell Collection they have been by any means. I think the idea that the trustees of the collection should have somehow slipped away their control and authority to a quango, which gives itself the right then to defer to unnamed experts. That to me sounds like a recipe for terrible mischief and absence of accountability.
That's an interesting point, when this issue of experts, as Jackson Carlisle has already mentioned, can be rather a wide definition. Just to pick up on a point that you made there about conservators perhaps giving the wrong advice, is conservation an inexact science, or is it because some conservators are better than others?
It's certainly not an exact science. Some conservators are better than others, but there are also differences of philosophy, and many conservators are in fact very concerned about loans and travels. Some conservators take the view that it's part of their professional responsibility to do the best that can be done and to make the best possible provision. The chair, Sir Peter, the trustees this morning talked about mitigating risks rather than eliminating risks. And as an insurance man, he's probably aware that companies like AXA Insurance, which pay out large amounts on claims of damage every year, put the increase in risks on loans that are made abroad at 6 times, as being 6 times as great as loans made in England or in the UK. And it's certainly not a science. Conservators claim in every generation that they've eliminated past mistakes, but there are always new mistakes being made. When Sir Peter speaks of a range of vulnerability in the artefacts of the Burrell Collection, I don't recognise that. Textiles are fragile. Pastels are fragile. Ceramics are extremely hard and resilient if they've been fired to high temperatures, but extremely vulnerable if they're dropped. Bronzes can be injured. Everything can be injured in different ways. Paintings, if they're on panels, can be stronger than if they're on canvas, which is a fabric and which becomes fragile with age. But panels are more immediately vulnerable to splitting and cracking with changes in humidity. And when panel paintings go on aeroplanes, we're putting them in the laps of the gods, because the aeroplanes change altitude, change pressure, temperatures drop, temperatures increase dramatically. And very recently, a high-powered conservator in The Hague advised an important collection in Britain to make sure that its painting, its panel painting, travelled on what was described as a combi plane, which is a plane which carries cargo and passengers, because the cargo planes are subject to much greater variations of temperature and humidity than our passenger planes. So even in today's aircraft and today's technology, there are varying levels of risk, and nowhere is there no level of risk.
I'd like to pass on to Jackson Carlo now.
I have to say to you, Mr. Daly, we saw the unseen collection at the Burrell too, and I have to tell you there is a very extensive collection of Tudor beds, and they all look very robust to me, more robust, I think, than many people would hope. I'm slightly worried that your evidence is straying into the principle of lending, really, rather than the matters with which we are concerned, which is the variation to Sir William's bequest. I mean, for example, I don't think anybody in the committee has been impressed by an argument that there should be no lending between collections. And although you are rather sniffy about some of the international pool, I mean, I have to say I saw the exhibition on Catherine the Great that was held by the National Museum here in Edinburgh last year, which was widely acclaimed. And I thought it was quite magnificent. And I'm afraid it wouldn't have been possible for me, as you suggest, simply to take myself off to the Hermitage and other places to have seen the items. And I did feel enormously privileged to have seen such a wonderful collection. So it's not the principle of doing it. And I think we have to acknowledge Sir William accepted that, because Sir William was quite happy for items to be lent within Great Britain. And therefore, the business of taking the item down and the business of putting the item up, I mean, with all due respect to the porters in Glasgow, I don't imagine they are any more or less clumsy than the porters in any other museum at the end of the day. These accidents can occur, and Sir William must have appreciated that that was the case. So the whole thing really comes down to the stipulation he made about international lending of his collection. And so really, rather than, you know, I think you said the Canova was dropped or something, and there was a crack in the three. This was really by handlers at either end. It could just as easily have happened here. So I want to focus on the international aspect of it. And that really comes down to, I imagine, movement by air, since I assume, I don't know, I assume shipping is not the preferred method for many items, or items generally now, but air is. And that is to understand how air travel has changed. Now, as a passenger, I used to be taken up in a Comet to go to Mallorca in the early 1960s and suffer horribly the entire experience. But passenger transport has changed dramatically. I assume freight transport has transformed dramatically. And so from both Mr. Daly and Mr. Wilkins, I'm interested to know, in point of fact, I understand planes can come out the sky, so I understand that you can split the collection. But I'm interested to understand, in point of fact, how much more improved the actual experience of a product being transported by air is today than at the point of air travel in Sir William's lifetime when he made this stipulation.
Well, on that, it's not really easy to speak with certainty or confidence because we as an organisation, although we've examined many dossiers of restoration treatments over the years, we've tended not to have access to the documents concerned with travel arrangements. Recently, we have in a particular case, and the documents we've seen have not been reassuring because even though it is the case, as you say, that air travel is relatively, compared with all other forms of travel, quite astonishingly safe in terms of passenger risks. But when fragile works of art, and we have to consider that all works of art are fragile. All important works of art are irreplaceable. When they travel, they're not beamed up onto an aeroplane. They're taken there on a lorry or in a van, and with or without a courier. And
to any other destination. I mean,
Sorry?
the journey to the airport is no different to the journey to anywhere.
No,
Right.
no, I know.
So it's the bit I'm trying to understand is the bit when it's on the plane.
Well, the bit when it's on the plane, we had a member of our organisation who was a former transatlantic pilot and who also owned some important paintings, and he was adamant that paintings shouldn't travel on aeroplanes as he knew them, and he described in graphic detail the struggle that pilots have to balance the needs of passenger comfort, for example, and supply of oxygen with fuel consumption on modern planes. It's a juggling act, and the extent to which pressures are maintained and temperatures can be maintained varies enormously. It's not a given predictably safe and unproblematic area in the view of that particular transatlantic pilot.
Mr. Wilkinson?
In essence, I would disagree. A modern freighter is very much similar to your passenger flight. I mean, it is twin-decked. All a combination aircraft is twin-decked. A freighter is the same. It has a lower and an upper deck. These are very heavily insulated and heated in most cases. Your modern freight is palletized, which means it is secured. It's secured onto the aircraft itself, locked in place, so that in most cases it prevents any form of movement.
So Sir William's experience as a passenger, when he flew by air, if he were still alive and flying today, would be totally different. Your argument is that the experience of a work of art in exactly the same scenario would be totally different to anything Sir William could have imagined.
Yes, you would be in Sir William's day, if there was air freight, which there would be limited, you would be loading to the belly of an aircraft manually or by conveyor belt and basically stowing and stacking what the best way you could. Nowadays that doesn't happen. You're forming and building actual aircraft pallets to balance weight before it goes on the aircraft. The position of that pallet will be worked out in relation to the aircraft's payload.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can I invite questions from Mark Griffin?
Yep. Can I just start with just a quick supplementary to Mr. Carlo's question? Don't know if Mr. Daly, do you have any examples of any damage which has been inflicted on a piece of art purely by the change in temperature, pressure, humidity in the course of air travel, and not the handling and transport previous or that occurs after the air travel?
Well, it's difficult to attribute damage that occurs, is known to occur in paintings, to the various parts of the journey that were undertaken. When the Matisse mural was removed from the building of the Barnes Collection to go around the world, it travelled on, against promises and assurances, it travelled on an open flatbed truck wrapped in polythene, carried at an angle of 45 degrees, and it subsequently went on by aeroplane, but to many other centres, but it was damaged. I do know that, for example, paintings that move around in this country, even modern paintings, clearly seem to suffer from their experience. I recently examined the dossiers on a painting by Laura Knight, which belongs to the National Portrait Gallery. It was bought in 1970 when it had recently been restored and lined by the dealer. It stayed in the National Portrait Gallery for 20 years or so without any problems. And then, because of increasing interest in the artist, it started going on regional tours within Britain, places like Southampton and Hull. And coincidentally, with those tours, it started this safely lined, brought into tip-top condition modern painting, not a century old, started to show signs of raised paints, cleavage of the paints. And a succession of restorers have attempted to fix this raising paint, detaching paints, by methods that alarm me as an artist. They include bringing out the hairdryer and blowing the paint with hot air until it becomes soft enough to press down with fingers, which doesn't seem terribly scientific and reassuring, and to stick it down afresh with glue. And after each successive attempt to fix this recurrent problem, the last restorer who treated it said it needed a stronger adhesive, but that it also needed more radical treatment because the last lining of the canvas with a reinforcing new canvas on the back was the source of the problem, or rather the last relining of the canvas, because another relining had been taken off in the interests of conservation. And on that occasion, all of the glue had probably not been removed. And glue reacts hygroscopically. Glue reacts to water and atmosphere. And research has just been published by conservators in Denmark that shows that those paintings that were lined with new canvases, not with old water-based glues, but with more recent wax resin adhesives, if they are subjected to relative changes of humidity of to 60%, the canvases react violently and shrink, and all the paint cracks. And I know of one conservator who experienced this. It was a conservator who once criticised our views on restoration. She had a canvas suddenly erupt into masses of broken paints. So it certainly happens, but it's not always easy to say what the precise cause was. What we should do, I think, is look at what does happen, what is known to happen. I mean, Nicholas Penny, if I can just, I know you, convener, you're not keen on in general principles on audio visuals, but this is silent. But this is a panel painting that was dropped at the National Gallery just before Nicholas Penny took over as director. It was repaired immediately in secret, and then the panel was placed in the reserve collection. This was the gallery's own panel. It had a sister painting, and the two paintings, until this accident, had been in the main Renaissance galleries. after the accident and the repair, both of the paintings, the damaged and repaired and the undamaged one, were removed from the public view and placed in the reserve collection, which can only be seen by the public under flickering neon lights for 5 hours a week under bad conditions. So that was an absolute loss, and it happened with the gallery's own painting and the gallery's own handlers. And the National Gallery would meet, I'm sure, many of the criteria of professional competence and expertise.
Ms. Leonard, did you want to come and raise a point?
Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to say that I feel that this is rather anecdotal evidence, probably, and of course accidents happen. Accidents happen in wherever you are. But it would be interesting if, I don't know if there are any figures available on just how many works of art are damaged as they travel around the world, and I'm sure it must be a very tiny percentage. But I just wanted to reply to Mr. Daly's assertion that conservation isn't a scientific profession, and on the contrary, conservation is it's a profession in this country. Certainly, there is training of conservators. There is a huge published body of work conservators publish. They keep in touch with each other in conferences and so on. There's a very vigorous and robust accreditation system of professional conservators in this country. There's also a body of conservation scientists who also work closely together, who collaborate, who publish. And, for example, there is a lot of publication about transporting works of art. And there have been huge developments in that, an artwork will be packed carefully, safely by conservators and art handlers. The case that it travels in will be specially designed to mitigate the risks of travel as far as possible, to mitigate vibration, for example, or changes in temperature and humidity. And data loggers will be incorporated into the case so that it is very obvious that, at what point something happened to that case.
Thanks for that. Mr. Daly, you raised the issue of humidity and the risk that poses to works of art. On our recent visit to the Burrell Collection, staff there pointed out the roof has been leaking consistently over a number of years, and the layer of insulation which sits beneath the roof is effectively a soaked sponge. Do you think that a precious art collection being housed in a building which has effectively a soaked sponge on the top makes for ideal conditions for it to be housed?
No, of course not. And I would certainly expect and hope that problem be dealt with as soon as possible, and it should be dealt with, and the necessary funds should be found as a matter of extreme urgency. What puzzles us and concerns us as an organisation is how, moving on from that specific technical problem, which is very, very serious, I heard this morning from the chairman of the trustees reference to the tour. Well, I don't know what the tour is or will be, or where it is intended to go, and what it is intended to be composed of. But it has to be seen that this kind of change and this kind of claim that somehow things have got safer than they were, so much so that we can reasonably and not dishonourably overturn the wishes of a very honourable man. I mean, Burrell may have made his fortune, but he gave up shipping and devoted his life to the collection of art. So for much of his life, he was not concerned with money. He was concerned with getting good bargains, obviously, but he was a principled man of taste and judgment and of enormous generosity to the city in which he'd grown up. But today, far from being the case that restorers have reached great heights of expertise, there is within the conservation world recognition that mistakes are not only happening, but they're inevitable. And at a conference of conservators in Lisbon in 2011, a paper was delivered in which it was contended that it is time for the conservation profession to learn from its mistakes, admit its mistakes, because it will then profit in the way that the aviation industries and the medical industries have profited from an open acknowledgement of mistakes. And when people ask for what are the actual figures of incidents of damage in connection with travel, it's impossible to give an answer because there is so much secrecy. So many people prefer to conceal injuries. If a collector lends to a museum like the Met and the painting gets damaged at the Met will offer to restore it for free of charge. It will not go into the public domain. And even when we learn of these things, we can't get the owners to admit that the incidents have happened. And we do know from hearsay that many, and Dr. Penny would claim this, I think, as well, that many more incidents occur, much more damage happens than is ever acknowledged.
Comments there, that's the first time, perhaps I'm mistaken, but that's the first time I've heard you mention the committee going against the wishes of Sir William. It seems that much of your evidence has been in opposition to lending rather than going against the wishes of Sir William. And if I took that to an extension, then we wouldn't lend or borrow at all, and so we would go against Sir William's wishes in doing that across the UK. Can I ask just a simple one way or the other, which is your principal concern? Is it lending and borrowing or upholding Sir William's wishes?
Well, the concern with the upholding of bequests is a specific concern. It's simply really, it's not so much a professional interest as a civic interest. It's a question of doing the right thing. To overturn a benefactor's terms and wishes, there have to be very good grounds. If there are such, and the grounds have to stand up. And what I've tried to do is make the connection between the wider problems which haven't gone away, which do exist, and which do have direct bearing on the attempts that are being made to overturn that prohibition.
Thank you very much. I just have one final question for Ms Leonard in terms of some of the points that Mr Griffin has already made about the state of the Burrell Gallery. When we were there, there were some textiles that had to be taken down to save them just in the nick of time from the water ingression. If you had to make a calculation, do you think there's more risk to the textiles leaving them in the Burrell in its current state or touring them?
Well, I think there's certainly more risk of leaving them on display in the Burrell Collection at the current state, but of course they've been removed from display because there was a risk, and so they have been put safely in storage. And I think the key point is that the decision should be made by professional curators, professional conservators, and they are the best placed to decide on a case-by-case basis. I don't think we could make blanket judgments about whether objects should be loaned or not. I think each object has to be looked at and it has to be decided on a case-by-case basis. And the conservation is really about balancing the preservation of the object with access to that object. That is the purpose of the collection. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all our witnesses. And I'll now suspend briefly before our next panel of witnesses. Thank you. Good morning. Can I welcome Professor George Gretton, who's Lord President Reid's Chair of Law at the University of Edinburgh, as our third panel, the whole panel, Professor Gretton. Can I ask you, Professor Gretton, do you wish to make an opening statement, or will we proceed straight to questions?
Just a few words, if I may.
Of course.
First of all, I'm not going to describe myself as an expert in Scots law, Mr. Garlow, but I know a little about Scots law. Obviously, I have no views on the policy of this bill. I have no views to offer there at all. One thing it was suggested that I should say very briefly was whether, if this was to be pursued, this objective by the City of Glasgow Council, whether this bill was the only means, or whether they could have gone down some other route, such as obtaining the consent of the charity regulator or the Court of Session. Well, there's a short and a long answer to that. The long answer would take about an hour and have 100 footnotes. The short answer is really they had no other option. This was really the only way to do it if they wanted to do this. So had I been advising them, I would advise them the same thing, to go down this bill route. A couple of things that occurred to me this morning. First of all, GB or UK. I'm a great admirer of SPICE briefings, but they actually say UK. And as Mr. Taylor said this morning, it's not UK, it's GB. That's the restriction. It's not a UK restriction, it's a narrow restriction. It's GB, so Northern Ireland is not in there. On inward loans, my reading of the agreement and of the will is that temporary inward loans probably are competent. So if that's been happening, and I heard that has been happening, then I think that's probably okay. But the documentation is not 100% clear on that point, but on balance, that's my reading. It is in the bill that would be competent, and that makes perfect sense to put the matter beyond doubt. And I think the only other thing I'm going to say is, didn't crop up this morning. I mentioned it to Mr. Taylor when we were arriving at the building this morning, and he said it had been considered, but I'm going to suggest it anyway, which is, if I were drafting this bill, I would put the agreement and the will in as a schedule to the bill, as a matter of convenience for future users. I know that it's in the promoter's memorandum has quotations, but when I was asked to look at this, I saw that, but what I wanted to see, that wasn't really enough. You really need to see all the documentation to form a view of this. So I think the Burrell Collection is going to be with us forever, I hope, and people in the future who want to look at the legal position really need the whole picture. It'll be very easy, I think, to put the agreement and the will in as a schedule to this bill. But as I understand, this had been considered and was not taken forward, so there might be reasons for that. Okay, I think that's probably it.
Thank you very much. I'd like to move to my colleague, Jackson Carlow.
Well, can I commend you on having answered all my questions before I had an opportunity to ask them? Which is a very remarkable talent, and I suppose I should have anticipated. So having clarified that, in fact, this is the appropriate course to go through, that there is just one other sort of legal question before others ask some of the moral aspects about overturning these things. Glasgow City Council currently lends delicate items such as tapestries and pastels to other institutions, despite an express prohibition from Sir William. And the Council argues that the terms of the will cannot affect items gifted to the Council before Sir William died, even though in some cases the possession of those items didn't transfer until after his death. I mean, do you agree with that interpretation of the law? And do you think that in interpreting it that way, the Council is kind of respecting the letter rather than the spirit of Sir William's intentions?
I'm not going to comment on the last one, spirit against letter. I'm going to be purely legalistic. On that, the purely legal question, I think it's arguable both ways. The most natural reading is that restriction about fabrics, etc., only applies to items bought by the trustees subsequently and not to the original collection. But there is an alternative argument, which if you paid an advocate enough, they would certainly put, that by implication that restriction was extended even to the original collection. The basis of that argument would be the wording of the will. The way the will is worded is that Sir William actually wished that restriction about fabrics to apply to the whole collection. That's the way I read it. Now, You could say, well, he couldn't impose that because the 1944 agreement had already put the original collection beyond his control. But that's not how he saw it. And in fact, the terms of the will tell us, I think, a little bit about what Sir William was like as a person, because he seemed to take the view that he controlled the entire collection, even after he'd given it away, and also nothing to do with the Burrell Collection, certain other properties which actually he had transferred. He seemed in the will to think he had continuing power over, and of course, when sure in reality, he did. And you could argue that because of the wording of the will, if the City Council accepted these future donations, then by implication, they must accept the terms of the will, which would apply even to the existing collection. So I think it's arguable both ways. That's my view of it.
Okay, thank you. Can I say, Professor Gretton, from text that I found as dry as dust, you have managed to breathe real life into the spirit and intention of Sir William, which had otherwise been quite lost to me. So I thank you for that.
Thank you very much. And I move to Mark Griffin.
Thank you. Perhaps not another legal question, but do you have a particular view on the moral question of overturning restrictions stipulated by donors?
Well, although I just said I was only going to answer legal questions, there is actually a legal dimension to this, because the question of to what extent legal restrictions relating to property should be able to last forever is one which frequently arises. For example, something entirely different, title conditions affecting land and houses. Should they last forever? If they were imposed in 1820, should they be enforceable forever? That's an issue which has come up, and it's been around for a long time. In Roman law, this was an issue, because you used to get testators in Roman law who used to like to impose conditions on property that they were giving to their heirs, which were to last forever. And the Roman had to tackle this very difficult issue. And they, in fact, on that particular issue, did impose restrictions how long a testator can control property after their death. And that has been the general tendency in the European legal tradition, that there should be some sorts of limits, that people shouldn't be able to control property forever. How that should be handled varies very much from country to country and the type of property you're talking about. So I think that with something like this, it's in principle not unacceptable that after a substantial period it could be opened up. That's rather a broad answer. But
perhaps are you able to give a figure on what you would feel an appropriate limit?
The reason I won't is because I'm not an expert in the world of museums, galleries, art, antiquity. That's not an area I have great knowledge of. The enthusiastic visitor to the Burrell Collection, I was one of the first people through the doors when they opened. But I'm not an expert, so I couldn't offer you a sort of time period. Of course, in the 1982 Act, which applied only to the Tate and certain other galleries in London, they had a 50-year period. But I don't have any particular view on what that period should be, because I don't feel qualified. If I was a member of the Scottish Law Commission for many years. If this were a Law Commission project, we would be getting in expert views on what the appropriate period should be for this type of property.
Do you have a view on how the decision that we will take as a committee in a parliament, if we were to allow changes to be made, how that would affect future donations if the donors thought that the restrictions and conditions that they set down could be changed after their death?
I don't think I'm qualified to answer that one. I'm sorry.
Perhaps I could assist in terms of the time limit. We have some written evidence today that arrived this morning from Neil McGregor, Director of the British Museum, who also has an interest in this matter, as he is advising Burrell Renaissance, and the British Museum may well have a very active part in any touring exhibition that goes ahead. Mr McGregor points out that the legislation governing the National Gallery in London recognises the need to respect donors' wishes but imposes a time limit of 50 years on the power of the dead to constrain the freedom of the living. And there's similar 1985 legislation covering the Scottish National Collections, which allows donors' considerations to be set aside after 25 years. Mr McGregor says, that seems to me to be an entirely reasonable position. The living are more likely than the dead to be able to take changing circumstances into account. We cannot know how the dead might have changed their mind. Do you wish to reflect on that from a legal point of view?
Well, that goes back to what I was saying earlier. Yes, I think, as I say, it's a general issue in the law about people controlling property for long after their death. And I think the law does have to put limits on that. And the longer the period of time, the less justifiable it is to have non-variable conditions. But I think it has to be sector-specific, the way one deals with that.
A difference between the London Gallery and the Scottish Gallery, 50 years and 25 years. Would you have any idea why that might be?
I don't.
No, right, okay.
I mean, if you want to speak personally, I think 25 does seem a bit short. All right, I'm coming out with it. 25 years seems a bit short. 50 seems more reasonable.
It's more reasonable, okay.
I didn't say that, but I said it.
The bill gives Sir William Burrell's trustees power to spend trust income in fulfilling their new responsibility, for example, in commissioning expert reports or paying the expenses associated with referring a decision to an expert under the draft lending code. Do you think it's appropriate for expenses to fall on the trust in this manner?
I haven't thought about that question. I think I'm not going to answer that. I would have to take time for consideration. I can't.
In terms of any other comments that you have on the structure or the effect of the bill, certainly from the evidence that we've received so far, there does seem to be a question mark around some of these delicate items and what Sir William's intentions were. And we obviously had different interpretations by the commissioners who looked at this matter in 1997, who wanted some restrictions on the lending of these items. Would it be appropriate for this committee to look at restrictions in order to fulfil Sir William's wishes?
The buck stops with you. I lack the technical knowledge to speak about fabrics, pastels, and so on. It's your job to decide whether there should be any relaxation at all, and if so, how far that relaxation should go. I think that's all I can say.
It has been suggested that the bill, you know, is very relaxed, so to speak. I mean, it kind of moves from the position of 1997, which did change the terms of the will, but there were still restrictions. This doesn't seem to have any restrictions, and as my colleague Gordon MacDonald mentioned in his written questions, it allows lending to take place indefinitely. Do you think it's too relaxed?
I think, again, I don't think I'm qualified to answer that. There's nothing, when I read this bill, there was nothing in it which made me feel particularly surprised, and I'm a great reader of legislation, both Scottish legislation and legislation from around the world, and as a non-expert in the world of museums, stressing that, there was nothing in this bill which made me go, gosh, I'm surprised. No. But there I'm speaking as a lawyer, not as an expert.
Do you have any other comments at all on the structure or the effect of the bill before we conclude?
The point about the schedule is not a substantive one. The bill would work with the schedule equally without the schedule, but I think it's a matter of future convenience. because the Burrell Collection is going to be in existence, one hopes, forever. And I think it would be perfectly straightforward, but there might be some reason which I don't know why it should not be done. If you want me to mention one of the other things, this doesn't really matter, but the wording of the bill just says power to lend and doesn't specifically say as well outside Great Britain as within Great Britain. Given the wording of the agreement and the will, it might, had I been drafting this bill myself, I think I would have spelt that out. I think it's not necessary. I think looking at it, it's unlimited, that lending power, and I think it can be taken to include lending out with Great Britain. But personally, I would have spelt it out.
You mentioned earlier the different definition between Great Britain and the UK. How would you define Great Britain? Because politically at the moment, that would include, say, the Shetland Isles or the Isle of Wight. That's my understanding. Yes. And which are, strictly speaking, over the water.
You're right.
Yes.
Yes. The lending, Burrell Collection items could be lent apart from fabrics and so on to Lerwick, indeed. Which is over the water. So Great Britain means England, Scotland and Wales, including detached parts thereof, but does not include Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is the United Kingdom, but not in Great Britain. So you're right, yes. So it would be competent for the collection to cross the water.
But then I suppose at the time Sir William Burrell was alive, the idea of touring his collection to Shetland would have appeared quite unlikely.
Would, yes. Indeed.
Thank you very much for coming to speak to us today, Professor.
Tina.
And we're now going to move into private session, so if I could ask for the public gallery to be cleared. Thank you very much.